All right. Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here with the Reverend Dr. Malcolm Foley, who gave us an amazing, provocative lecture as part of the God of Justice class, which, if you haven't watched the lecture, or you're like, there's an ability to watch this lecture, then yes, you can go to faithandpolitics.net, where you can get his lecture, along with like Pete Enns and Dom Crossan, Drew Hart, who we'll be talking to live in a couple days. Anyway, they're all there. You'll be able to watch. And then people send in questions. And we got so many good questions. We had to have a pre-conversation just of how to structure all the questions to get at all the different threads that Malcolm's lecture inspired. But before we get into this, I would love for you to share a bit about your own journey of faith, and then the role, the intellectual search, both in divinity school and such, and at Yale, and then going on to do your PhD. Like, how did that faith thread connect with the desire to invest so much historically in the struggle of justice, and how the Black church experience in America is kind of witness to the rest of us?
Yeah. So I grew up in a Christian home. Parents love the Lord deeply. And when I went to undergrad, I focused on, I did a religious studies degree and a finance double major, with a classics minor and almost enough to do a theater minor as well. And so there was a lot going on there, but I got into specifically church history and theology because I had a comparative religion teacher back in 10th grade who challenged my faith in some ways that it needed to be challenged, and it got me just deeper. It actually just got me deeper into the faith. So studied it in undergrad, and then went to Yale Divinity School for my MDiv, and focused especially on the theology of the early and medieval church. Loved that. That's where I encountered the Greek church fathers. Loved them the most. Then I came to do my PhD at Baylor, and wanted to do my dissertation on the Greek church fathers. But in the third year of my program, I took a class on Christianity after the Civil War, and we're talking about like the fundamentalist modernist controversy, debates over biblical interpretation, fights over power in seminaries. And what was going through my mind was, wait a minute, this is a period of time when thousands of Black men are being set on fire in front of crowds of thousands of people. What's the church doing and saying about that? And I looked for books. On it, articles on it, and found much fewer than I would have liked. So I was like, well, I guess this is what my dissertation is going to be. So I wrote on Black Protestants responding to lynching in the late 19th and early 20th century. That focus on the most violent instantiation of white supremacy in American history, I think it shaped me. I think it shaped me in some pretty significant ways. But it also led me to ask the deeper questions of, okay, well, where does this come from? Is this just a matter of hate and ignorance, or is something else going on there? And that's what led to me writing my first book, the Anti-Greed Gospel. Why the love of money is the root of racism, and how the church can create a new way forward. I'm deeply convinced that if we want to build truly just communities, specifically anti-racist Christian communities, it's actually imperative that we build anti-greed Christian communities, because at the root of our conversations about race and racism is not questions of identity or of ignorance or of hatred, but fundamentally of greed. That there's a material root that undergirds this evil. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's where my emphases have come from.
Yeah. No, well, and I can understand why a love for the Cappadocians would be connected to asking those questions, especially when you think of the kind of clarity they had around a host of different justice questions, and seeing it intricately tied to how they're working out the relation of the persons in the Trinity and such. But that wasn't the lecture, so we're not going to have an excursus.
I know.
Everyone should go read some Nazianzu's sermons. Really straightforward on the impact of greed. And one of the things about that that it showed up in a number of the questions.
Mhm.
But even the way you frame the thesis in your book, it's surprising to me how many Christians never lose sleep that Jesus had one either or. And it wasn't like, are you Jewish
Mhm.
or are you a Christ follower or are you
Mhm.
Buddhist, or it's God or man.
Mhm.
It's the
Mhm.
only either or for a guy that effectively dodges theological questions with a story that functions
Mhm.
like a Trojan horse. And the moment you start thinking about it, all sorts of stuff comes flying out. But
Yep.
yeah,
Well, and that's one of the things that I want to press. I want to press that actually the most significant spiritual struggles that the Christian faces is a struggle between God and mammon for your soul. You'll either live a life where your life decisions are submitted to the Lord, or you're seeking after mammon, the accumulation of power and money. Um, Jesus says that ultimately leads to fear and anxiety and worry, which is why the verse immediately after Jesus says you can't serve God and mammon. He says, therefore, or because of this, that is because you can't serve both God and mammon, don't don't be anxious for your life, what you'll eat or drink, or for your body, what you'll wear, because it's indicating that a life that's actually submitted to mammon is a life of worry. It's a life of worry and of fear and of anxiety, because mammon doesn't actually love you. But
well, are you suggesting that
yes.
that Jesus doesn't want us to become increasingly efficient and effective, and that we should hack our lives so that we can more easily organize other people, their labor, and their means to generate more wealth for us and an abundance
Hmm.
of free time so we can overconsume and hopefully have a kind of palliative care through the gifts of mammon to overcome the anxiety we have about our own finitude and fear of death, belonging, and meaning? Because I thought
Yes.
that's exactly what Jesus was suggesting. I swear, it's called the American Dream.
Right. And I mean, even just the fact that the way that we are generally taught to think about our resources is that the best thing for us to do with them is to grow them, or to hoard them, or to consume them, when what we get, especially throughout the New Testament, is that actually the things that you have are not fruits of your achievement, they're gifts of God's grace. And because of that, the most important thing that you can do with them is actually share them. Christ didn't. What we're told in Philippians 2 is that just to have this mind among ourselves, which is ours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, didn't see equality with God as a thing to be selfishly held on to, but instead emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant, being found in human likeness. That is, the Son of God took on flesh in order to share everything that he has with us, or as a number of the fathers will say. The Son of God became man so that man might become God. That is, Christ does actively seek to share everything with us. Therefore, when we look at our resources, why do we cling so tightly when the Son of God, who we claim to be united to, didn't cling tightly to what was rightfully his? Instead, he poured it out to share with us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, there's a reason that was a hit among the early church worship uh, worship gatherings, so that Paul could quote it. Before we jump into some of the specific questions in
Yeah.
your lecture, you introduced three different heroes that taken together, connected these three different principles for
Yep.
us to consider from the history and witness of the Black church, and it's David Walker, Ida B. Wells, and MLK Jr.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to just kind of say a brief thing about each of them. Obviously, people got to hear more in the lecture,
Yeah.
but and how they exemplify kind of the three kind of different focus that you're pulling together.
Yeah. So the three kind of qualities that I want to call people to are moral clarity, relentless, the kind of a fierce, relentless perseverance, and nonviolent love. All things that I deeply believe that Christ calls us to. I use David Walker as an example of the first of moral clarity. He's my favorite abolitionist in American history. But when you read his appeal to the colored citizens of the world, it's sharp. It goes right for the jugular. It's just like, this is how profoundly evil racialized chattel slavery is. It's one of these texts that drives that drives other abolitionists who were kind of gradualists, where they're like, well, let's just do away with this thing slowly. Like, we know it's bad, but it would require the uprooting of our entire society, and let's take our time with it. After they encountered this text, they're just like, oh no, like, this is evil, then we need to do away with this now. And so but that moral clarity is necessary when we look at the world, when we look at the world around us. We have to call what is evil evil, and we have to orient ourselves accordingly. To the second point, a fierce, relentless perseverance. Ida B. Wells is my example there, specifically for her anti-lynching work. She's the most important person in the history of anti-lynching activism, and over the course of her decades-long career, she lays out probably what are all of the different ways that individuals and communities could resist lynching. And even when there were threats against her, like threats against her life, kind of institutional obstacles that she faced, people who she started working with who then stopped wanting to work with her, regardless of any of those things, she was like, I'm going to devote my life to the ending of this particular evil, regardless of what I end up facing. I think that kind of perseverance also ought to be descriptive of the people of God. But lastly, in referring to Martin Luther King, I think it's important that all of these things are rooted in a fundamentally nonviolent love. That is, that we see all of our neighbors, not just our neighbors, brothers and sisters in Christ, but also even those who present themselves as our enemies. That what drives us in the pursuit of justice is a love even for them. That even those who present themselves as my enemies, they fundamentally are not my enemies. They're being used as a tool of the enemy. And so my goal is not their destruction, but their redemption. I want to see them, basically I want to see them redeemed as much as I want to see the oppressed, as much as I want to see the oppressed redeemed, and to see their oppression cease. And for King, that's not just a tactical consideration. It's a theological one. It's because he was deeply convinced that that's the way that Christ taught his people to function and to operate. And what you see in his ministry and in his activism is you see the attempt to work that practically into everything that he did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that, like, taken together, it's not just like a theological vision, but the kind of the tools for which one works for justice become clear,
Mm-hmm.
because so often I think a lot of us experience a temptation to use the very tools that are being used on behalf of injustice to set it to right. So,
Mm-hmm.
metaphorically, they built a cross, so we're going to build one. And and this is something I'm in 2 weeks is Theology Beer Camp, the big homebrewed event, and I was talking with Kelly Brown Douglas about the keynote and stuff she's working on. And one of the things that came up in our conversation that we had talked, and then I watched your lecture right after you'd sent it to me, that there was this big resonance, is that one of the biggest challenges for progressive Christians is in that third piece that King represents. And and she said something like, the freedom of a Christian is the freedom that enables the love of every other. And that also means we have to resist imagining a just world without any other. That we don't get to imagine a world with dead enemies, but transformed hearts. And that is a I want to holler amen, but then I also don't want to talk to my enemies. So I'll pray for them and Jesus can work on it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is I think it's a real struggle, and to me, that is one of the greatest gifts. If you think of the church writ large in America, that the Black church has preserved in ways that the kind of colonial origins of so many of the predominantly white denominations, they all came in with an a priori commitment to ignoring who was already here and the humans that were trafficked here in a slave ship. And so and you can see how accommodating to that really raises that first question that you brought. Like, do we want to just slowly evolve, or like at some point are we going to be an abolitionist? Which reminds me of like Nyssa's whole Gregory of Nyssa, your Cappadocian homeboy right there, who a long time ago told the church, just to clarify, the owning human thing,
it's not cool.
it's not a growth area.
No. And one of the few early Christian theologians to just say it out loud. And to lay it out very clearly. It's like, look, this is deeply contrary to the way that God has called us to live with one another.
Yeah,
the rarity of that declaration is disconcerting. But I'm glad we got it. I'm glad we got it somewhere.
Yes. Well, see, I like to think that in like 2,000 years, we'll be like the end of the early church period when they're telling church history. Right. And so they'll just go, oh, well, it took a little bit to get going. But, by the end of the early church, you could just read Malcolm's book. Like, this is what happened. Okay. So I'm tempted to keep having fun with my own thoughts about it. We'll have to do that again a different time because we had so many questions. And just we in the chat, Kate was like, well, where can we get Malcolm's talk? You could go to faithandpolitics.net and you'll get his along with a host of others later this week. Drew Hart's joining to talk about his, so you can grab it there. And always tell everyone you can donate nothing all the way up to $1 million
or beyond.
No, I have limits. That's how I say no to mammon. I'd say no to mammon.
Look at you.
Yeah. All right. So here's an excellent question from Carlos. He says, doesn't framing this as spiritual warfare risk spiritualizing what are fundamentally political and economic struggles?
Yes, Carlos, it could. If and this is and it's funny because this is actually a theme of the last chapter of my book. Because our tendency is to over spiritualize political and economic struggles. One of the reasons why I want to frame it as spiritual warfare is because when you engage in a life of obedience to Christ, which necessarily requires political and economic commitments, especially a commitment to the poor and the needy, and not just kind of an individualized commitment to them, but a deep relationship of solidarity. And one that requires actually the building of different essentially, I believe that churches are actually meant to be distinct political economic entities, especially in the midst of a world of neoliberal capitalism. Like one of the calls to the church is to be an alternative society. But I want folks to understand that the struggles that you face when you do that are going to be much more significant than what you see politically and economically. I think about the fact that King and Du Bois near the ends of their lives struggled with depression because they saw how slow progress was. And one of the reasons for that I want to remind people of is that you're not just up against systems, like you're up against demonic entities. We struggle not against flesh and blood, but against the powers and principalities. And I want people to understand that your commitment to political and economic justice is not just a commitment against particular structures, though it is also deeper than that. So you have to understand that it will likely be the case that progress is slow. But you have to remember that we're engaged in this work because it's work that Christ has begun and work that Christ will finish. Even if we die, that doesn't mean that we lose. That spiritual framing of it is what then gives us the stamina to do the kind of political and economic work that needs to be done.
Yeah. And do you think part of where questions like this come from is the way in which a very a strong dualism has been internalized
Mhm.
by so many within
Yes.
the church. And normally people will point to how like uh, dualism creates this kind of escapist view of salvation and that kind of things. We're
Mhm.
thinking about the positive, but it also like dematerializes the soul, right? And its
Yes.
groundedness and embodiment, which was
Yes.
a problem for even thinking about the incarnation. But it also like
Mhm.
dematerializes the gospel, where it's like, well, we're going to
Mhm.
save people, and then if we have extra time, we might use
If we
three
get
to
around
four.
to it,
Yeah, we might use
maybe they can eat.
3 to 4% of our congregational budget
Yeah.
to do something for the well-being of other people, right? Like,
Yeah.
and that
Mhm.
dualism thing is like is runs rampant when you think
Yeah.
of the pushback that you talk about in the lecture of how David Walker is pushing back to those that are like, oh, we'll slowly get around to getting rid of. But in the meantime, we could probably we want Christians to feed their slaves well.
Yeah.
Or like have good working conditions. And eventually we're going to
Yeah.
evolve past it, right? Like so much of that
Yeah.
is we're Christianizing them.
Mhm.
And in this kind of logic, so it's entailed in a kind of dualism that is utterly problematized the moment you say God was in Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want people to be reminded that so historically, especially coming out of Presbyterian circles, we have this understanding. Some people have this understanding of the spirituality of the church, which practically means the church only talks about spiritual things. And historically that that narrative was pressed in order to keep people from talking about specifically racialized chattel slavery. They're like, that's not an issue. That's not an issue for the church. Um, and one of the things I want to remind people of is that the church is a spiritual entity, yes, but it's also a political economic entity. The people of God have always been so. That's always been God's intent for His people. In Deuteronomy 15, they're given essentially the framing of an economy where then there are no needy people in their midst. And then in Acts 4, when after the Spirit descends on the people of God, like that's the way that they're described, because God is not just gathering a spiritual community; He's gathering a political economic community, one that bears witness to the world that there's another way, to live and another way to exist, one where everyone has the resources that they need to be able to flourish, both materially and spiritually. Um, our salvation is a holistic salvation, and being invested in one another's salvation means that we're invested in one another holistically.
Yeah. Yeah. That reminds me of I think it's in Walter Rauschenbusch's like BSU, the student group for Baptists on campus devotional,
Yeah.
where he's talking about that passage in Acts 4, where he's like, Jesus was well aware that human beings would love an escapist version of salvation. So after he was resurrected, ascended in Luke, he comes back down, lectures them on the kingdom of God for 40 days, and says, you got to wait till the Spirit comes. And you can tell when the Spirit comes because they just immediately start a commune. And and he's like, and the church has been hoping to end the gospel story with the ascension ever since, and I think that's there, and it actually like it really fits with Jennifer's question, which is like the practical side of this thread, where
Yeah.
she asks, how do you address Christians who argue that focusing on material conditions diminishes the primacy of spiritual salvation?
Yeah. I mean, part of it is this. Part of it is this understanding of that last part of that clause, the primacy of spiritual salvation, as though there's a hierarchy of body and soul for the human being, as though when Christ takes on flesh, that He does so only to save human souls and spirits, and not their bodies as well. He takes on flesh. He takes on the entirety of humanity in order to redeem the entirety of humanity. And we have a tendency, specifically historically, and this goes back to the greed point. We have a tendency to separate soul and body because it allows us to continue to exploit and kill each other. If what I care most about is your spiritual situation, which I can't really see or evaluate, but I can say, well, if you've said these words, then I've done my job. And it even comes back to our understanding of love. In 1 John 3:16, we're told what love is, that Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, therefore we ought to lay down our lives for one another. And then in the next verse he says, if any of you has material goods and sees a brother or sister in need and has no pity on them, how can you say that the love of God is in you? Which is to say that love is not just about the way that I feel about you, it's about my material commitment to you. And that's also the way that God expressed his love to us. I mean, you think about him freeing his people from Egypt. You think about the incarnation, his death, his resurrection, ascension, return. All of these things are bodily material realities. None of that denies the effect that they have on us spiritually, but they're inextricably bodily acts of redemption. And so I think it's just important, especially in a context where the tendency toward over spiritualization is so rampant. It's important for us to press that, yeah, but the Lord works through bodies. Like even your own intimacy with the Lord is often shaped through bodily habits of prayer, of fasting, of giving to the poor. All of these are things that you do with your body in order to bring it in line with your spirit. That's what practice of ascesis are about. Practice of discipline. They're practices of bringing your body in line with your soul. Because we tend to be profoundly undisciplined in both. And so it's my hope that actually pressing the material brings you deeper into the spiritual. Because if you see those two things as dichotomized, you fail to understand both of them. And you fail to live into kind of the fullness of your humanity, because you are inextricably both. So
Yeah. All right. Michael has a question here. If David Walker and Ida B. Wells both saw violence as potentially necessary, and the email was very long where he was talking about the different ways, why should we categorically reject what they didn't? And maybe kind of introduce us to why violence was a live option, and what role for you as a Christian that the third point with MLK comes in.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, not unlike us, but also kind of throughout history. I mean, they're both dealing with very violent instantiations of white supremacy, and similar to. So I was named after Malcolm X, and so Malcolm X's rhetoric is also very. It's really compelling to me. He'll basically say, "Look, if somebody is coming after you to kill you, you're worth defending. So put him in the ground." Like that. It makes sense. But as much as it makes sense, it's not Jesus. So my favorite quote. This is the epigraph to the chapter in my book on nonviolence, and it's from Antonio Gonzalez, and he says, Christian nonviolence is not based on an ethic of respect for life or on the tactical superiority of nonviolence, but on the determination to confront evil at its very root. So it's a matter of, and we can have conversations about whether or not it works or whatever. Those aren't my fundamental concerns. My fundamental concern, my thing, even just about the Christian life in general, the only goal of the Christian life is Christ-likeness. And so my question is, how does Christ call us to treat our enemies? And he says to love them. And I don't see any. There are no mental gymnastics that I can go through that can get me to the point that says that loving somebody means killing them. Just me. Like there may be others who can figure out what kind of gymnastics will be necessary to get to that point. I can't do it. I also see, particularly historically, especially those who were constantly kind of dwelling in these broader contexts of violence. The more you're in those contexts, the more reasonable violence becomes. This specifically happened to Francis Grimke, a black pastor in the during the lynching era, who pastored the same congregation for about 45 years. And over the course of that time, he goes from thinking education is the way to stop lynching to saying, hey, actually armed self-defense is the only way we're going to stop it. There's an erosion. There is, at least for him, an erosion of hope that happens over the course of that time. They're like, we've tried all this other stuff. maybe the only way to stop a mob is to kill them. And one of the ways that one of the ways that I want to frame that is like that's an erosion of hope. Once you begin to dehumanize even the mob, you lose the opportunity to love them. And Christ has called us to be relentless in our love for one another, and it's hard, and it's one of the reasons why what I call people to is a creative kind of nonviolence, because it's really easy. Violence is the least creative way to respond to violence, but few of us have used our ethical imagination to consider, like, actually, what could love look like? What might it look like for me to have a deep commitment, like never to kill you, but to think about other ways to struggle for justice and for life. I think that's the kind of creativity that we're called to, because there is a certain sense in which to resort to violence is to say it, I think, frankly, morally lazy in some ways. I think what Christ calls us to is a little bit. It's difficult. It's difficult, but I think it's what he's called us to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and David has a question that comes along these lines, where he said, "What about situations where nonviolent resistance has failed repeatedly? Doesn't insisting on nonviolence become complicity?" And in his larger email, he talked about the way you have state-sanctioned violence for the historic oppression of African Americans in the United States, or the imprisonment and assassination of nonviolent leaders in, say, Palestine right now. And then you're looking at that situation going, well, look, they've been trying. You arrested their Dr. Kings and Gandhis. When that, what do you do in those situations? And in the larger email, he's like, I resonate as a Christian with everything Malcolm said. And then as a privileged white male in charge of a progressive congregation, like at some point, like, wouldn't it be better for us to be the ones to act with aggression than those that are going to receive the most kind of, state-sanctioned violence and such?
Yeah. I feel like I'm going to frustrate some people when I give this response, because our goal is not to get the kingdoms of the world to act like the kingdom of God, because they can't. They don't have the resources to do it. The commitment that I'm calling people to is creative anti-violence. That is not just the refusal to engage in violence, but the insistence on undermining violence wherever they find it. If you do that, you will be a threat to a violent empire. You just will, because your insistence on not only not engaging in that violence, but when you see it, and by violence, what I mean is what tends toward the death of your neighbor. When you make yourself an obstacle to that death, you become a threat. You become a threat to that system. And so that is but the thing is, like, the pressure is not on. I mean, and this is something that I think we tend to do. The pressure is not on you to overthrow that system. So I think about this with global neoliberal capitalism. Like, the goal, I'm not telling people that the goal is like, you got to be the community that overthrows global neoliberal capitalism, because you're not going to do it. We're going to find other ways to exploit each other because we love to do it. No, the goal of these communities, specifically church communities, is you have an opportunity to build an alternative society that is then an invitation to the rest of the world. That's why God called Israel. Like, they were supposed to be a beacon to the nations, not a judgment on them, not a kind of exclusive club in their face, but to be an invitation, to be a look in the midst of this world of exploitation and violence. Here, those things are not here, because Christ rules here. And if you want to get in on it, repent and believe, and you can, and by the Holy Spirit, you can see the way that the Lord shapes a community without domination and exploitation. If you place the pressure on yourself or on your community to overcome the world, Jesus says, in this life you will have trouble, but take care. I have overcome the world. He already has. That's what he did on the cross. On the cross, he embarrassed the powers and principalities and put them to shame. And also, as we're told in Hebrews 2:15, he took on flesh in order to free those who all their lives were held in slavery to the fear of death. And so much of what ends up driving even our activism is the fear of death. And what Christ wants for us is to be a fearless people who can love our neighbors, especially the poor and the needy, especially those who are subjected even to state-sponsored violence. And we have the opportunity to place ourselves right next to them and face whatever that entails. And so ultimately, it's not up to us whether or not it works. What's up to us is, are we going to be found where Christ would be found? Ultimately, it ended in Christ's death. It could end, and likely will, in ours as well. But what's important for us is to be found where Christ is. And when he returns, whenever he chooses to return, to be found doing the work that he called us to do.
Mm-hmm. All right. Maria wanted to raise the practical question. She said, how do you respond to those that argue King's nonviolence was strategic rather than theological, that it worked in that context, but isn't universally binding? And in her larger email, she talked about that tension between King's leadership in the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and your namesake, Malcolm X. And it's a longer reference to reading when we did a class with Adam Clark on Black theology and read the Cone book, looking at King and Malcolm and such.
Yeah. I think for King himself, it was theological. I mean, the reason that he always framed it in the context of Jesus's teachings, and even with his interaction with Gandhi. I mean, Gandhi's interaction, it was his own interaction with Jesus too. It comes from Jesus. And so for him it was, and even for him it was that I think much of his own kind of political thought is just based on kind of operationalizing a theological commitment. And it, like I said, it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that it worked in those contexts. But I don't think, but the fact that he was faced with violence didn't kind of make him think, oh well, like maybe violence is actually practically the best way to go. No, because his commitment to nonviolence is rooted in an understanding of what it means to love your neighbor, also to love your enemy. I noted this in the lecture that one of the fundamental commitments, one of the commandments in the nonviolent movement was that we seek justice and reconciliation, not victory. Which is to say, my goal is not to beat you. My goal is to reconcile. My goal is to reconcile with you. That's a theological commitment. Like, just at its very root. Strategically, most people are aiming to fight to win. But what lies at the root of this movement is no, like the goal is justice for everybody, including for you. The fact that enemy love lies at the root of the Christian ethic, like that is something that I think we cannot forget, and we are encouraged by a lot of our history to forget that ethic lies at the root of our faith. Like that's specifically what Christ exhibits on the cross, this love of even those who killed him. That lies at the root of our faith. It's like it's a non like this. The other thing I want to frame to people is that like it's a non-negotiable. It's part of the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives, that the Holy Spirit drives us in love toward one another, even those who might frame themselves to be enemies. So with that, I would say if it were merely a strategic commitment, I think he had ample opportunity to change his tactics.
Yeah. One of the things about that, and you talk about it in the lecture, Lakeisha here raises it in her question is, how do you address the criticism that focusing on figures like King sanitizes their more radical critiques? And you mentioned in the lecture, as especially as his kind of public voice moved beyond just tackling racism, but addresses capitalism and militarism and imperialism and such. What was the tripartite, or I can't remember the line.
The triple evils. Yep.
Yeah.
So part of it is like his nonviolence, like, is a radical critique. The word radical, it comes from radix, meaning at the root. Like, he's very much getting at the root of these issues. In the last 2 years of his life, he emphasizes the triple evils, as I said, which he names as racism, materialism, and militarism, white supremacy, capitalism, and war. And one of the things that he will that he'll emphasize, especially in those last few years, is that you cannot do away with one of them without dealing with all three, because you've got to uproot this injustice from its root. And it's rooted in greed, it's rooted in lies, and it's rooted in violence. All of those things work together. You're not going to be able to deal with one of them, as people, I think, have attempted to just think that racism is just this thing that you can just deal with as racism, and not deal with the economic roots of it, not deal with the violent instantiations of it, to not deal with the lies at its root. All of those are deeply radical critiques, in the sense that they're getting at the root of the actual issue. But the nonviolent commitment is also a radical commitment. It's a commitment to every human being that you come into contact with, including your enemies. Like, that is, that's not a commitment that people just kind of naturally come with. They're like, oh, you present yourself as an enemy? Great. I want to remove you from my space. But what a commitment to Christian nonviolence is something that is distinct from that.
All right. So Lisa asked, you criticize capitalism explicitly. Are you arguing Christians must embrace socialism or another specific economic system?
Yeah. You don't have to. You could, if you have the opportunity, you could, because exploitative capitalism is bad. That does bad things to people. Kind of necessarily. The profit motive encourages us to see one another as commodities rather than human beings. But also, like, my goal is not to propose a different global economic system. My goal is for, I think back to Acts 2 and Acts 4, it's that the people of God are told to live in a particular way, that they recognize that their resources are not meant to be hoarded or fundamentally to be consumed, but that they're meant to be shared. Like, that's how the Lord has called us to use our resources. So we're told by our capitalistic economy that the most important thing that we can do with our money is grow it. And sometimes we then read the scriptures through that same lens. So I think about this with the way that we think about the parable of the talents, a text that I think we can often use to justify capital accumulation. And it's interesting that it's in Matthew 25, and it's immediately followed by the sheep and the goats. So it's immediately followed by Christ's account of the judgment. And the questions that he asks are, how do you treat the poor, the needy, the prisoner, all these folks? And what that indicates to me in context is that parable of the talents is about how you use your resources, and the best return that you will get on your resources is the investment that you make in the poor and the needy, which is explicitly what he says in both Matthew and Luke, when he talks about storing up your treasures not where moth and rust can destroy, but storing up your treasures in heaven. In Matthew, he doesn't really tell you what that means, but in Luke 12, he does. He says, sell your possessions and give to the poor, and in so doing, provide purses for yourselves that won't wear out. If you ask Jesus throughout the Gospels, what is the best use of my resources? He does not say, that you invest and grow it as much as you can. No, he says, invest it in as Chrysostom will say, the only barns that you need for your possessions are the stomachs of the poor. Like, that's what, as a reflection on the parable of the rich fool in Luke 12, who has these barns full of stuff, and he he's like, oh, how am I going to fit all my stuff? I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And then God comes to him that night, and he's like, actually, your life is being required of you tonight. Doesn't sound like the best use of your resources, does it? But that framing is, I think, really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Even that parable about storage barns, like, and, when it gets preached on, especially in the early church, reading that back through, when you look at the history of our species, that it was the moment as civilization, in scare quotes, came up with the ability to store goods, and really after the agricultural revolution, not move. That's where you see a giant increase in violence between our species, because it's now you aren't storing things in the well-being of your neighbors and hunter-gatherer communities and moving forward. Now you're storing up possessions for yourself, securing yourself. And what does the possession of things require? Protection from violence of people who are in need and would like it for themselves, right? And so that's, you can see that if you're just reading Genesis 3-11, that stuff emerges. So to me, it's kind of fascinating how it takes people people that are inheriting 2,000 years of church history, but if you just happen to be an American, it requires like noticing how humans evolved culturally in vintage storage to generate state violence for you to go, man, I wonder what people would have heard when an itinerant Jewish peasant said, you want to know about storage? Because you know who was storing shit. Like, it was everyone that was shipping it to Rome or to Herod's palace. It wasn't to go, you know what, you Galilean fishermen, we got to make sure we redistribute things so your kids eat. It could put someone in a situation like Zacchaeus, where he would take the opportunity to betray his people to have access to goods.
And paired with that, and to the Zacchaeus thing, the parable of the 10 minas, which people also use kind of parallel to the talents, comes immediately after Zacchaeus, because it comes immediately after this example of when Zacchaeus encounters Christ. He sells half of what he has to the poor, repays those who he had defrauded fourfold, and then you get this account of the 10 minas, all like these texts that, like I said, are often used to kind of justify accumulation. The context of them, particularly in the Gospels, is no, like, the most important thing you can do with your resources is care for the needy and sharing.
Yeah, and the fascinating thing to me about that conditional if in Zacchaeus, the if payback fourfold, is specifically what you do if you've stolen from another Israelite, right? Like, he's saying, I'm going to get to know these people who are in a situation where I feel moved because of the embrace of Christ to give. But if I find out, like, as I get to know them, that I've done this, I'm obligating myself to make repair, right? And anyway, and then somehow it is, one of the, I always like talking to other people that have to preach enough they actually know the Bible. Let's just say that's not ubiquitous across theologians. And I will get an email from mainline Protestants to go, well, you and Malcolm, y'all mentioned like Luke 7 followed by Luke 18. And I had to keep pausing to go read the Bible in the podcast. They don't pause if I say concrescence, superject, prehension, geist. Anyway, sorry for the aside, but everyone, feel free, keep your New Testament near you, high quality material.
It's good stuff.
So Christina asked this question around individualism. Isn't greed too individualistic a diagnosis when it comes to the problem of structural evil?
Yeah. To which I would say no, because when I refer to greed, I'm referring to a demon. And so it's my short answer. I go from the individual to the structural to the demonic. Like, that's the level at which I'm referring to it. I mean, to go back to Christ's words in Mammon in Matthew 6:24, where he says, you can't serve two masters. You'll either love one and hate the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve both God and Mammon. When I refer to greed, I'm talking about the service of an alternative God. And the fact of the matter is that when you get a bunch of people together who all serve the same God, they build systems to continue to serve that God. And so when we talk about what in many ways what exploitative capitalism represents. It represents essentially a system of mammon worship, a system where what drives it forward is greed. Worship drives it, like worship drives that system forward. And so I want people to recognize, so basically I want to do what John does in the book of Revelation, where he is showing, he's showing this church. So these churches are going through persecution, and they're like, this is really bad. We're facing persecution. And John's like, yeah, not only is it bad, it's actually worse than you think, because you just see the emperor. I have just seen like multi-headed demonic beasts. Like, that's what you're actually up against. I want to do the same thing with us here in the way that we frame structural evil. It's like, yes, you see these exploitative systems. I want you to see that what's behind this is a multi-headed demonic beast. And so you will. The initial response is going to be, I want you to feel even more trapped than you thought that you were before. But then, as John also does in Revelation, the image that overwhelms all of that is the vision that he gets of the throne room of God, where he constantly returns to. This reminder that God and the Lamb are actually on the throne of the universe, that even though these multi-headed demonic beasts claim to be in power, they spew are lies and violence and exploitation. But the God of life is actually on the throne. That then gives you the resources not only to interpret the world around you, but it also gives you the stamina to endure in the midst of the world around you, because the saints don't overcome by violence, but by their witness and by their blood. And so I want the people of God to see what we're up against, and to understand like what's going to be necessary for us to stand in the midst of a world that where mammon runs pretty rampant. So there are individual requirements of that, but there are also communal ones and cosmic ones, because I deeply believe that the gospel is a personal, communal, and cosmic reality. That God has not just saved us as individuals, but He saved us as a people for the purpose of the redemption of the world. If we at any point lose any one of those 3 points, we lose something significant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this reminds me of a question that I couldn't even figure out how to put it in a short thing to pop up. But a couple weeks ago, the interview I did with Cornel West came out, and I joked about being in a swing state where before Joe Biden stepped down, I wanted to make a sign that said, "My heart's with Cornell, but this is a swing state, so I guess Joe." And one of the emails I got after your lecture was like, obviously Christians' investment and fidelity to the God of justice is way bigger than electoral politics.
Yeah.
But the clergy was like, I work at a Methodist church, and she's like, it gets really awkward around these situations. And in my congregation, I had people who were like, Trump's horrible, but I hate abortion, so I'm voting for him. Just vote blue no matter who, cheerleaders, to Cornell's the only one that will say anything about what's going on in Israel and Palestine, and he has an economic vision that moves me, so I'm voting for him. Or Christians shouldn't vote. This whole system's screwed up. It's demonic. I'm not voting. And she's like, and each of them have something where I can see how their faith is animating it. And they all are making like demands in a sense in their conversation to like, will you validate me, person that serves me the Eucharist, that this is a faithful way of working out my faith in the electoral situation. So I wonder what kind of practical advice for both any person reflecting on those challenges, but also how does the kind of witness of the 3 stories that you share in your lecture kind of help us orient or value what we do in the voting booth per se?
Yeah. All right. I'll make this controversial point about presidential elections in this country. So first of all, it's a very small element of our political witness.
Yeah.
Second of all, for the entirety of American history, all our presidential elections have just been largely choices between different manifestations of Antichrist. In the sense that, in order to be president of the United States, you have to sustain and support what has essentially revealed itself to be a violent empire. Like that's just it's part of the job. And if I became president in some way, and I sought the dismantling of a violent empire, like I wouldn't be president for very much longer. And so I want people to understand that that's what that is. So it's not going to be super helpful for you to put a lot of your eggs in the basket of what I do with that particular action.
You mean the slightly more benevolent cross builder isn't Jesus's agenda?
Right. I think this is a historical point, is that the more, as time has gone on, Christians have gained, in some cases, more political power, which has then required us to find ways to justify us continuing to have political power, which often takes our attention away from being the people of God, because we end up spending a lot of our time thinking how do I protect what I have, and so there's that element of it. I know folks who I respect, who go the route of not voting, and then others can kind of justify other decisions. I think what's more important is the way that you're investing in your actual local and state community, because those are things that actually shape the day-to-day life of your neighbors even more. I mean, I think about when the executive branch went after Chicago, and just folks locally were just like, no. And then they backed off and went somewhere else. Like when you can gather the community that you're actually a part of to be committed to love of neighbor, especially the love of your marginalized neighbor, that's the bulwark that you can actually invest in, because the fact of the matter is that once you get to a certain level, for you to maintain yourself at that level, it requires a level of compromise that it's pretty significant. And so I don't want us to ever kind of place our hope in particular political outcomes, because even the victories that we might win on behalf of the poor and the marginalized are likely going to be fleeting and temporary, because we're not up against flesh and blood, we're up against powers and principalities. And the nature of a nation state is that it requires violence in order to maintain its existence. And so yeah, people can make, I think, a number of those decisions that I don't want to adjudicate too sharply. The question that I'll ask is, how does that actually play itself out in your community, when folks, under any regime, when folks come after the marginalized in your community, what's the kind of community that you're going to be? Are you going to be somebody who stands up for the marginalized, as Christ calls us to, or will you kind of acquiesce to the powers? I want us to be building communities that are the former rather than the
latter. I know, Malcolm, but we tried loving our enemies. Now we just got to vote for someone to animate our resentments.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing, man. It's just it feels good. It feels like the thing about anger and all those things feel good. It's why we do them. We do those things because they feel good. I want somebody to fight. Like I want somebody to fight for me. That's what I really want. I want my enemies. I want my enemies to lose. I want them to lose badly. That's just it's visceral in me. And so then when I encounter Christ and he says stuff like love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you and stuff, I'm like, sounds a little soft.
Yeah.
But as a Christian, we believe that the most powerful thing that God has done on our behalf is he died on a cross. Like that's wild. And I want our communities to to really take that seriously, that Christ doesn't beat domination throughout domination. He beats it by dying and by embarrassing the powers with the very tools that they thought they could defeat him. And it's a challenge to all those who are united to Christ to deny themselves and take up their cross and follow him. Like that's the people that we're supposed to be, a people who don't necessarily kind of insist on our own rights, but that when we see our brothers and sisters in need, that we pour ourselves out for them. And this is the other, it's in Philippians 2. Paul says, look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. And in a lot of our translations, they supply like only and an also. So it's although it says, look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. And there's no only and also in the text. But that's scary to people because they're like, well, if I'm not looking to my own interests, then who will? Well, it's why he's telling this to the church, because he's like, if you're building a community where everybody is looking to meet everybody else's needs, everybody's needs get met. If everybody's focused on just their own stuff, there are going to be some folks who don't have enough to live. But if everybody is looking to everybody else, then that's the only situation in which everybody gets what they need. And that's the kind of ethos that ought to be not only present within our churches, but also between our churches in a way that then spills out to the world around us.
Yeah. I mean, thinking back to the Zacchaeus story, one of the things that strikes my mind is Jesus had never been to Jericho before, but he knows that the well-dressed short dude in a tree's named Zacchaeus. And I fill in the dots exegetically, like they were trying to cancel him. He was coming into town and they're like, you won't believe this guy Zacchaeus. He said, even a Jew like one of us, but he's taxing the shit out of us. And and they're like complaining so much. And that he's like, they've canceled him. That's why I know his name. And then Jesus is like, hey, you want to be friends?
Yeah.
And you want to be friends with them? Because I know that y'all live in a world where you cancel each other and deny the humanity of each other. And Zach, you've been so good at exploiting people. You have a great wine cellar. So we're going to go to your house. And I just think of like the kind of the confidence Jesus has there of the power of rehumanizing the other on kind of both sides of that like political divide. And it's enacted because one, he knew his name and recognized him in a city he's never been in because they defined themselves against him. You know who are glad we're not? Zacchaeus. We may not have much, but that guy, he works for Rome. And we know he's taking extra off top. And so that that image of friendship. And it's after that Jesus gives truly he too is a son of Abraham. And I think that a lot of us, when we don't get to that third point, right, like of anti-violence, not just in our actions, but in our rhetoric, if it's not anti-violence, then we're closing the possibility of going to our political enemy's house that has a great wine cellar and watching them become one Jesus raises up as an example of faith and going, he too is the son of Abraham, because we've already inscribed them in a narrative of ultimate opposition rather than ultimate reconciliation.
And the example that we're given is the way that Paul frames his own testimony in First Timothy, where he says that Christ came to save sinners, of whom I'm chief, because he's like, I was formerly a blasphemer and a persecutor, but the Lord showed me mercy so that he might exhibit his patience as an example. Like what he's essentially trying to remind us of is like, look, I was a wretch. I was out here I was out here chasing Christians down, and yet Christ still redeemed me. Thank you for the thumbs.
Well, the Holy Ghost just gave you an
It's just
echo right on your screen.
but that, like, that, one of the reasons why I think Paul does that there is that, like, this shows that God desires to show his grace to all. And, like, I'm an example of that, because somebody looking at my life would be, oh, like, that dude is as far gone as it gets. And yet that's also precisely the reason why Christ appeared to him. He's like, I want people to know that even the people who people just think are super far gone, those are the people that I'm particularly after.
Yeah. All right. Before we run out of time, you got some pragmatic questions. So you're about to fix a whole bunch of clergy's concerns.
Let's go.
Just nice, easy. Settle these forever. Samantha, Presbyterian minister in Chicago area, I believe. She said, "How do we maintain unity in congregations with diverse political views while pursuing justice?"
Yeah. My answer is going to seem trite, but by pursuing justice. It's a recognize the people in your community who are dying and invest in them not dying. Like, that's just like that. Like, that's like that, being engaged in those habits. So this goes back to Jesus in Matthew 6, where he says, like, when you pray in this way, when you fast in this way, when you give to the poor, give in this way. Which is to say that, like, prayer, fasting, and giving to the poor they're just habits of the church. Like, they're just things that we do together. We are people who are bound together by the things that we do together. And so we can say things about unity till we're blue in the face. If we're not doing things together, that unity doesn't have an opportunity to actually work itself out. So when we take the Lord's Supper together, when we pray together, when we fast together, when we give to the poor together, when we see our neighbors dying and we invest in their not dying, like, those are the kinds of things that I think that shape us more than us just having debates about particular political views. Because we're getting kind of better and better at kind of justifying our own positions to ourselves. And sometimes the only way to break through those is by actually doing the things that Christ called us to do, which will then bring us into proximity with people that will then have us rethinking the way that we think about those people. So, for example, think about this just broadly, the way that we think about the poor in our midst, that we're encouraged by our economy to see people who lack material resources, to see them as in that position because they did something. You did something. You didn't take advantage of the system in the way that I did. Clearly, that's your problem. I'm going to maintain distance as a result. And Christ wants to bring us closer to one another in relationships of solidarity. And it's one of these things that we find out, like, a lot of, especially the deep poverty in our country, it comes from people's, like, lack of communal support. It's like somebody loses their job and they're in an abusive family, so they can't fall back on family, and they just have nowhere to go. And that's not that's not their fault. But there's a book called $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America. And in that, like, it's one of the things that pops up over and over again, is that people face these circumstances that place them in this situation of vulnerability, and they have no one to lean on, and that leads to essentially a cycle of poverty. If you enter into all of these conversations with the assumption there's something about this person that's wrong, you are immediately putting up a wall to the love and solidarity that Christ is calling us to show to one another. But you're only going to be able to actually find that out when you actually do the things that Christ has called us to do. So when it's actually a habit of your life to be in those relationships with the needy in your midst. So I would say that the way to deal with that is by pursuing justice together, because it's not an option. Like, it's not actually an option for the Christian to, like, do it or not do it. you go back to Matthew 25, like, it's like those are the questions that Jesus is going to ask us.
Yeah.
So I'd like us to have like good answers to those questions.
So you don't think the solution is just to avoid 90% of Jesus's teaching?
Yeah,
Oh, all right.
Sorry.
All right. So I guess that's one. All right. So Nicole asked, how do you avoid reducing Christian faith to social justice programs? And in her email, she said that's how certain portions of her congregation respond when she's articulating their investment in the local community and stuff as gospel enactment.
Yeah. Man, I want us to, like I said, and this is a historical issue that we've bifurcated, especially in a number of Protestant circles. Like, just we've bifurcated and diluted what we think salvation is, like what Christian faith is. Like, it's not just what we believe. Like, this, go back to James and the way that he talks about faith and works. Like, these are not, this is not this kind of obscure conversation about this big idea called faith and this big idea called works. Like, he's just like, look, if you got a brother or sister who doesn't have daily food and clothing, and you just pray and say, go be warm and well fed, like, you ain't done nothing for them. Like, it's just like, there is, if we believe that Christ, like, our understanding of what Christ has done for us is an act of love, and if we are called to, in union with Christ, also be examples of that love, where he says, the world will know that you're my disciples by your love for one another. Love is a material commitment, according to the New Testament. And so it's not an act of reduction to say that the love that Christ has called us to and enables us to exhibit is a material commitment. These are just when I say that the Son of God took on flesh, what I'm saying is, like, that actually is also going to materially require some things of me as I seek to be united to that Jesus. But the thing is that it's not just a social justice program, because what drives it is, this is the work that Christ is doing and the work that Christ is ultimately going to finish. And so I'm not getting bound up in whether or not this works in a particular way. What important to me is, this is the way that Christ told me to operate. This is the way that Christ told me to treat my neighbor. So that's what I'm gonna do. I want to simplify it in that. Way. That what the Christian faith is about is not only believing that Jesus is who he says he was, but doing what he says. That's what he says in Matthew 7. He's like, the person who builds their house on the rock is the person who hears the commandments and does them.
Yeah. That's also how he identifies his siblings, right?
Exactly.
When they come to, hey, your family's outside.
Yeah, my family are those who do the will of my Father. Like, that's what. There it is.
All right. There's 3 more questions here. Eric asks, what about Christians who worry that politicizing faith drives people away from the gospel?
Yeah. I mean, when we talk about politicizing faith, if we're talking about associating the faith with a particular political party or whatever, I mean, obviously never do that. Because also both of our political parties are, like, just both two sides of a neoliberal coin. But we do have to understand that our faith does require particular political commitments, in the sense of, it means something about the way that I care for my neighbor. Like, insofar as that is political, yes. Like, it just is. Like, you can't hide from it. But that's just, I mean, when I hear political in that context, I just think practical. Like, all the practical things that we're committed to doing are part of building a society and the way that we interact, like, with one another. That's not to go back to the words of Jesus I quoted earlier, that that the world will know that you're my disciples by your love for one another. Basically, the world will know by the community that you build, which is a political and economic community. Like, they're gonna know by the way that you actually operate, and that's what an actual gospel life is. That it's not just a bunch of people who think the same thing, but it's a bunch of people who are actually living in a distinct way. And so yeah, so obviously this is not a matter of aligning yourself with a particular party or political figure. But the things that Christ has called us to do are things that will be, I think, interpreted by some as political, in the sense of like you're building a community,
Mhm.
and supporting a community.
All right. Rachel asks, do you emphasize
Yes.
moral clarity? Point
Mhm.
one. The three, doesn't this risk creating new forms of self-righteousness or purity politics within progressive Christian spaces?
Yeah, it can, if it is not pressed a um, with an equal kind of humility and care. Um, when we engage with other people, like there needs to be the fundamental understanding that everyone I come into contact with is not only a person to be loved, but that everyone I come into contact with actually has something that I need for my Christ likeness, just as I might have something that they need for their own Christ likeness. Um, even the focus of humility, and this I learned from some of my Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters, and the way that the saints are understood. That repentance comes not from you looking at yourself and seeing how terrible you are. It's when you're so enamored with Christ and drawn toward Christ that then you look at yourself and you see, oh my gosh, here are all these things that are keeping me from being united to Christ. Obviously, I'm going to push those things aside. Self-righteousness has no place in that paradigm, because my focus is not on me to the extent that I'm trying to build this kind of pure picture of myself or whatever. No, I'm too busy focused on Jesus and who Jesus has called me to be, and the way that he's called me to treat my neighbor. And I'm going to stumble and fall over the course of that process. Like that's an expectation, because I am a sinner just like any of us. But that also is not going to lead me into despair, because Christ also reminds me, it's like, yeah, like I know I'm still calling you to where I am. And so when you get a group of people together who can exhibit actually true humility, because they all recognize how far each of us has to go, it's one of these things that undermines a kind of self-righteousness and purity politics that can seep in. Because I want to be able to hold when I want to be able to hold hands with everybody who can see that people are dying around me, and we can and we want to come alongside one another. And when my brother or sister falls, I want to be able to give them a reason for the hope that I have, and why I can continue going even when other people are giving up. And it's because this is what Christ not only has called us to do, but it's what he's actually empowered us to do.
Yeah. All right. Here we go. The final question
All right.
from Tyler. How do you hold space for Christians who are genuinely wrestling with these issues but haven't reached the same conclusions you have?
Yeah. I The main thing is just I want I want folks to see and experience how good a life lived in this way is. So this is the way I felt when I preached the Sermon on the Mount. My co-pastor and I preached it over the course of like 44 weeks. Slow walk through the Sermon on the Mount. It's
Well,
glorious.
that's definitely a slow walk.
It was great. But one of the things that I wanted to press with the
How
congregation was
many
like,
sermons use less than a sentence as the text?
we had at least a sentence for each of the
Okay,
sermons.
okay. I was just thinking,
uh
the first
yeah,
sermon,
yeah.
blessed.
Yeah. No, we had at least a verse
Okay.
for each sermon. But some of them were literally just a verse. Um, and one of the when I introduced the sermon series, I told the congregation, I was like, you're probably used to hearing, if you hear preaching on the Sermon on the Mount, you're used to like people watering down what Jesus said. Be like, Jesus didn't really mean this. What he actually meant was something that's much easier for you to do. And I was like, I don't want to do any of that. I just want you to like hear Jesus's words, and then like try it. Just try it. Just try acting as though Jesus meant this and said it to you. And and operating in that way, folks in the congregation like tried this stuff and they're like, wait a minute, this actually leads to a better life. And I'm like, yeah, that's actually what Jesus was trying to tell you when he preached this sermon. Similarly here, like I don't people don't have to agree with me when I say this stuff. I want to tell them that, you know, as somebody who has basically by the Spirit sought to build these habits, like there is a deeper joy and a peace and a power that comes with actually living in this way, with actually releasing the things that are not, that I can't control, trusting those things to the Lord, and then but then also being really uh intent on being obedient to the Lord's commands myself. That actually shapes, like it shapes the way that I view those who present themselves as enemies. Where there was a time when that would have led to just anger and stress, and every time something blasphemous happens in the world, like I freak out and all this kind of stuff. Or that can manifest itself in prayer, even for those who present themselves as enemies. That it reshapes you, like it reshapes you, and has reshaped me in some ways that like I can feel it. I can see the ways that I'm different from the way that I was 5 years ago because of just being intent on, like when Jesus tells us to operate in a particular way, I'm like, okay, well let me actually do that. And it takes time because it's not something that's going to happen in just a day. It happens as we continue to walk with the Lord. uh he reveals to us the commands that we're running from, the commands that we're like, I don't really want to do that. You're like, yeah, I know, I'm gonna keep telling you though. And he does that in love. I think about the image in Revelation 3 as he's talking to the church at Laodicea. He says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. He's like, he's knocking. He's gonna keep knocking. Um, and and um, when you open that door, like, I mean, all the things that I try to encourage here are things that I deeply believe that Christ is actually encouraging us to do. It's not just coming out of me and my imagination. Like this is just like when I see this in the scriptures, I want to take it. I want to take it seriously because I really do believe that it's the path to the abundant life that Christ has called us to.
Excellent. This has been so much fun. And not just because when the doctor is also a reverend, the editing is dramatically less, but it's always fun to talk to a theology nerd who also has way too much of the New Testament on recall that it creeps out a lot of your academic peers. And yeah, so we have a ton of mutual friends, and a number of them that said you and Malcolm will like each other a lot, and I'm like, you might be too reformed for me.
Look, man, I tend closer to my Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters now. So.
Good. It's always good to everyone can grow beyond their particular Baptist roots. But for those that have joined over the course of this, because now by the end of we got like 300 or 400 people on the stream here.
Oh, nice.
If you want to join and haven't checked out Malcolm's lecture along with a host of other of his peers, you could go to faithandpolitics.net and you can join up. You'll get the lectures and the other Q&As. And then Thursday, Drew Hart's joining for a Q&A, and Tim will be here then. Tim, who was the one that was like, no, you and Malcolm are really going to get along, has family obligations, which now he just set us up for a little bro date, and looking forward to the next time we get to do something like this. Do you want to tell people where to connect with you and stuff online? Because you're at Mosaic, right? In Waco?
Mosaic Waco. Mosaic Waco is the church. And all of our sermons and stuff are all online on YouTube. But I'm on Instagram and Threads at rev.malk. Yes, I'm there. And you can also pick up the book, The Anti-Greed Gospel: Why the Love of Money is the Root of Racism and How the Church Can Create a New Way Forward.
Hold on, we're going to unmirror the camera. Now you can show it to them and they'll see
sorry. Okay,
yeah, now it's easier to read.
There we go. The Anti-Greed Gospel: Why the Love of Money is the Root of Racism and How the Church Can Create a New Way Forward. A lot of the things that I was talking about today can also be found there. But thank you all for listening.
Oh yeah, spectacular.